Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 599. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. The absolutely massive week of news continues, so I have a lot to get through on today's show. Please share the show as hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. Of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and follow me on Twitter, where I post all my articles, other news stories, or op-eds that I think are important, as well as every show, at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter or X. All right, let's get into the news today. All right, the first story up here is one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, and for quite a while now we've been talking about Ukraine's manpower shortage. However, this new conscription law that's been implemented by Ukraine is making things far worse. I wrote this one May 19th, the Libertarian Institute. Ukraine's latest conscription law stretches workforce. So Ukraine's newest conscription law went into effect on Saturday, raising concerns that the country will be unable to fill critical industry jobs. The law increases the number of men who can be conscripted and requires all males to take additional registration steps. The operator of a steel plant in Kyiv, Ria, explained that there is a growing staffing concern over the conscription law, and the company had already cut back on production. He said, the plant's chief said, if they continue to mobilize, we will not have enough staff to operate. We are all talking here about the existence of the company. Under Ukrainian law, men have to register at the mobilization office to take a job at the plant. Members of the Ukrainian military have also come to the plant in an effort to catch men to send them to the front. Over the past 2 years, Kiev has drafted 3,500 of the plant's 18,000 employees. Many of those who have went to the front have been killed. The editor of the plant's weekly newsletter said that they write an obituary every week. One of the plant's employees that was drafted complained he often lacked small arms ammunition at the front lines. And so think about that. And, we talked about soldiers lacking artillery shells in the past, but we now have people and soldiers in Ukraine saying that they are on the front without small arms ammunition, which is really insane. I mean, the West has donated Ukraine millions and millions and millions of these rounds. And so, I know it's been a long war, and certainly a lot have been distributed, but if Ukraine can't even logistically get small arms to its frontline soldiers, I mean, things must be looking really bad. The owner of a car repair shop in Kiev is also concerned that he will be put out of business by the mobilization expansion and that his employees have already been conscripted. He said, with the new law, people will be mobilized and we will have to shut down and stop paying taxes. And he added that the new law was also unclear and unfair. Zelensky signed a conscription bill into law last month that lowered the draft age to 25 from 27 and required men to provide more information to the mobilization officers. On Friday, Zelensky signed a bill that allows prisoners to join the military and increases the fines for those avoiding military service. As Russian forces advance, Ukraine struggles to recruit enough men to fight on the front lines. And I did see, this is often hard to confirm, but as you see more statements, some of them leaking into the mainstream press and then videos online. Again, the videos are hard to confirm, but I saw a few of them, so it makes me think, this is somewhat accurate, that now the men that Ukraine is putting on the front lines are very poorly trained. They're under-equipped. There's not enough of them. The defensive positions are lacking, to say the least. They're not very secure, and so this is really just questionable even why you would continue to send men to these frontline positions at this point. Now, I think a part of that is maybe how Russia is fighting, and Russia is kind of exploiting this very poor Ukrainian tactic here. I think Russia, in a lot of places in Ukraine, such as the areas around Kharkiv, and we'll get into that next, seems not to be interested in just taking as much territory as quickly as they can, but rather grinding down and wearing down the Ukrainian military to the largest extent possible. I think that Putin probably understands that gaining territory not only comes with a lot of difficulties and a lot of losses of personnel and equipment, just, moving through and taking that territory, but I'm guessing minefields, things like that are much harder to operate through. And so it seems to me that based on how the Russian military has been proceeding recently, that their goal at this point is not necessarily to conquer the territory with their military, but rather grind down the Ukrainian military to the point it either collapses or that Kiev finally becomes aware that they have lost this war and agree to negotiate. And then any additional land that the Russians want, they will take through the negotiation table, not the battlefield. So that kind of seems to me to be what's going on here. Now, we have this article from Day to Camp, May 19th, antiwar.com. Putin says Russia creating a buffer zone in Kharkiv in response to Ukrainian attacks on Belgorod. So the Russian President Putin said Friday that the purpose of the Russian offensive in the northeastern region of Ukraine is to create a buffer zone in response to Ukraine's cross-border attacks. Putin said, now, about what is happening in the Kharkiv direction, the Ukrainian authorities, are also to blame for that because they shell and continue shelling, unfortunately, residential areas of borderline territories, including Belgorod. I have said publicly that if this continues, we will create a security buffer zone that we are doing. He added that the region has been targeted by Ukrainian forces throughout the war, and those attacks have ramped up in recent months. And I don't think there's any dispute of what Putin is saying there, that these attacks have ramped up in recent months. I think Ukraine's been pretty forward about that as well. So, also on Friday, Ukrainian President Zelensky warned the Kharkiv offensive could be just the first wave of a wider Russian assault. Ukrainian officials have previously said that Ukraine's lines risk collapsing wherever the Russian forces focus its offensive. So that is the kind of other option of what's going on here. It's not so much that Russia isn't interested in gaining territory in northern Ukraine, in the northeastern region of Ukraine here, but rather they're interested in drawing as many Ukrainian forces from the south, where they're actually interested in taking territory by force and seeking to do it that way. Ukraine has been asking the U.S. to allow the U.S. to use U.S. provided weapons on Russian territory. The U.S. has been pretty vague about its response on the issue, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying the U.S. doesn't encourage or enable Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory, but adding ultimately Ukraine has to make the decisions for itself about how it's going to conduct this war, and the State Department has refused to elaborate on his comments. And there was this funny exchange. I think, I want to say it was Matt Lee, but it might have also been Liam Cosgrove. It was somebody in the State Department was going back and forth with Matthew Miller. It was either Miller or Patel, one of the State Department spokespeople, and this is what the State Department is repeating. And so they're trying to get clarity, and they're saying, so does this mean you approve or don't approve of the attacks? And then they give this convoluted response again, but with attitude saying, I've been clear, this is our policy. And it's not clear what that policy is. I think if you read between the lines, what the policy is we are allowing Ukraine to do this. We're not going to prevent Ukraine from doing this, but we don't want to look and publicly endorse it because of the backlash, including from Russia. Including any Ukrainian attacks on Belgorod using U.S. weapons could risk major escalation. After UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron said Ukraine could use British weapons to attack Russian territory, Moscow summoned the British ambassador and warned that Russia could target UK military sites in response. And so I think there's probably a concern in Washington that they made this policy public. Russia is going to retaliate. And look, there are ways that Russia could retaliate. I'm sure there's large numbers. By large numbers, I mean dozens of U.S. soldiers, Western mercenaries in different places in Ukraine that Russia is aware of. They could probably attack and take out those sites and those people, if they were provoked, and that could be one of their responses. So, very concerning here. All right, top U.S. general said there are no plans to send U.S. trainers to Ukraine, so this is a little bit good news. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's General Charles Q. Brown, told reporters on Monday that the U.S. currently has no plans to send troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces, but suggested it could happen once the war is over. Right now, there are no plans to bring U.S. trainers into Ukraine. Once the conflict is over and there's a better place, then I would suspect we would be able to bring the trainers back in. So that was a statement from Brown. I think the reason that this is problematic, of course, is once the conflict ends, that's going to require Ukrainian neutrality. So if the U.S. is planning to bring military trainers into Ukraine and NATO trainers into Ukraine as soon as the war is over, that's obviously going to be an issue for Russia. And so my guess is that this will never happen, that the West is never going to be able to train troops in Ukraine again. But it will depend more on whatever deal Russia and Ukraine come to end the war. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, May 19th. Zelensky rejects Macron's proposal for Olympic truce with Russia. On Friday, Ukrainian President Zelensky rejected the idea of a truce with Russia during the Paris Olympics, which will be from July 26th to August 11th. The French president proposed the truce in a recent call with Zelensky. This is what Zelensky told the French president, according to AFP. Let's be honest, Emmanuel, I don't believe it. Who can guarantee that Russia is not going to use this time to bring its forces onto our territory? We are against any truce that plays into the hands of the enemy. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this story is not because I think it's surprising or anything, but this does seem to be the general consensus in the West on any kind of conflict or issue right now, is that a truce doesn't help you to revamp at all. It only helps your enemy. And so that's a reason that we could never ever have a truce, right? The same thing is true in Israel, where any kind of ceasefire is, oh, this is just a time for Hamas to recalibrate. Well, during that time, the U.S. is going to ship Israel tens of thousands of bombs and other arms, right? Isn't that it's going to be far more effective for Israel. But no, they don't want a ceasefire. And so this is just the anti-ceasefire rhetoric that's so prevalent in the West. All right, next up here, Dave DeCamp, May 21st, antiwar.com. Zelensky says NATO should shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine. So Zelensky is asking NATO countries to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory, dismissing concerns of potential nuclear escalation. So my question is, what's the problem? Why can't we shoot them down? Is it defense? Yes. Is it an attack on Russia? No. Are you shooting down Russian planes and killing Russian pilots? No. So what's the issue with involving NATO countries in the war? There is no such issue. Zelensky said in an interview published by the New York Times on Tuesday, shoot down what's in the sky over Ukraine. Zelensky, so that was a really wild comment from Zelensky. Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have expressed envy of Israel after the U.S. and UK helped to intercept Iranian missiles and drones that were fired at Israeli territory. This is what we saw in Israel, not even on such a large scale, Zelensky said. In an interview, the interview appears to be the first time Zelensky has publicly asked for direct NATO intervention since he pleaded for a no-fly zone over Ukraine in the early days of the war. The Times also recently reported that Ukraine has asked NATO countries to send troops to Ukrainian territory for training. So this just seems so desperate to me. My guess is that there's multiple reasons this will not happen. The first is that if there are air defense systems that the West is willing to spend in Ukraine, I think they're probably willing just to send those to Ukraine. I think at this point, the problem is the reason that Ukraine isn't getting more Patriot batteries, isn't getting more interceptors, is a lack of availability of them. And where Western countries feel, well, we need all these Patriot interceptors deployed around China. We need to keep our own in the Middle East for concerns of Russia, Iran, the Houthis, Hezbollah. We need some, in the U.S. We need some in Europe to deal with the threat of Russia should a NATO-Russia war break out. And so, I think if you just look at the production strains. They've gone so far as to have Japan alter its constitution in order to have Japan send its Patriot missile interceptors to the US so we could send more of our Patriot interceptors to Ukraine. So I think we see the supplies are fairly strained here and starting to shoot down Russian missiles. Again, if they're willing to do this, they'd probably just send the batteries into Ukraine and have the Ukrainians do it. So I think maybe Zelensky partly misunderstands the problem here, although you do kind of understand, and not that this is in any way suggesting I think we should implement this policy, but the Ukrainians have heard for 2 years that they're the most important people to the West and that they're the bulwark preventing Russia and saving the international world order and all of this, right? And Israel, they get the same rhetoric about the Middle East and everything. And so, for them to ask, well, why aren't we treated like Israel? Of course, everybody in the U.S. could kind of understand the difference. But from the Ukrainian side and the pledge they've got from our leaders, I'm sure it is confusing for their country's leadership. So there is major risk of escalation here despite what Zelensky says. And of course, the major places for escalation may be Russia targeting those interceptors in NATO countries. All right, next up here, Zelensky remains in power despite presidential term expiring. This is something that we've talked about on the show in the past. I don't think this necessarily, I've seen some people within the anti-war camp say things like, this means that Zelensky is no longer a legitimate leader. I think that's more for the Ukrainian people to decide. If you're in a wartime situation and the people of Ukraine are fine with Zelensky going on as leader. Now, I'm not so sure that's the case, and I don't think the U.S. should be backing Zelensky. But again, we need to be pulling back our support and allowing the Ukrainians decide where to go from here and not saying that, oh, their president's illegitimate. I don't like claiming some leader is illegitimate of another country. Additionally, I'm not so sure that this is going to really alter Russia's policy, at least in the near term. Now, one day, if a Ukrainian leader starts to come to the fore that could be seen as replacing Zelensky and could be seen as either a pro-Russia candidate or just somebody who's willing to make a peace deal with Russia, I think if either of those things happen, then Russia may say, well, Zelensky's illegitimate anyways, his mandate from his election has expired, and so we're, willing to negotiate with this new guy or something. Those kinds of things are possible, but I don't think Putin is going to look at the political landscape in Ukraine right now and think that, oh, if I remove Zelensky from power, the prospects for reaching peace are somehow better. I think in some respects, Zelensky, despite everything he said in the past 2 years and, his personality, which seems to at times be, according to his own advisors, messianic about the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of hardline Ukrainian nationalists who are also willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. So it may be better to keep the actor Zelensky in power, who seems to be somebody who can change their political opinion. At least he's not a true hardliner. All right, moving on to the news about Israel and Gaza, and for the Palestinians, it's all absolutely horrific, abysmal, and as an American, it just makes me absolutely sick that my government is supporting this to the degree that we are and really enabling it. All right, so first up here, report, Biden won't oppose Israel's plans for Rafah escalation. So, Israeli officials have agreed on a more limited operation in the southern city of Gaza that won't be opposed by President Biden, the Washington Post columnist David Ignatius reported on Monday. Ignatius said Israeli officials have reached a consensus about the final assault against 4 Hamas battalions Israel believes remain in Rafah. Ignatius wrote, instead of the heavy attack with 2 divisions that Israel contemplated several weeks ago, government and military leaders foresee a more limited assault that U.S. officials think will result in fewer civilian casualties. For that reason, Biden won't oppose. Despite issuing a warning about Israel for its plans to attack Rafah, Biden has not imposed any consequences as the Israeli military has continued to escalate in the city. He backed the Israeli capture of the Rafah border crossing, which has halted distribution in the city. Distribution in the city and into Rafah, really. So U.S. officials Israel has made clear to the U.S. that will continue to escalate in Rafah. The Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Monday that Israel is committed to broadening the ground operations in Rafah and to end and dismantle Hamas and recovering the hostages. So a couple things here that I think are really important, of course, is this is the Israelis just spitting on Biden's red line, peeing all over it, just absolutely mocking Biden to the greatest degree. He told the Israelis they had to have a plan for the civilians before they entered Rafah. They didn't have the plan, and the Israelis have now pushed 800,000 people out of Rafah with nowhere to go. This is unbelievably disgraceful that the U.S. could not have even held Israel to coming up with some tent city in the desert that they're going to deliver aid to. Even that bare minimum standard of not deliberately provoking a famine, Biden couldn't hold that red line. No punishments for Israel. This is absolutely unbelievable. Now, I'd like to add that this doesn't seem to be any better for the people of Rafah or Gaza, Palestinians, right? So having this operation be scaled down and take longer isn't necessarily going to help anyone. You know, the problem is that Israel has seized a border crossing and no food is getting into Rafah or Gaza at all. And so without the food entering Gaza, then the famine is going to set in even faster. And again, that's really what's going to end up killing a lot of these people. I'm sure Israel bombs will account for a lot of the destruction and a lot of the deaths, but a lot of it, and maybe even most of it, will be from the deaths because there's no medical equipment in Gaza, the deaths because people are dehydrated, they get illnesses that are absolutely treatable, or they starve to death, which is all happening right now in Gaza. So the Biden administration is just green lighting that. And it's not just southern Gaza here, it's also northern Gaza that Israel is carrying out pretty intensive operations in. So Israel bombs hospital in northern Gaza. Reuters reports Israeli forces thrust deeper into the Jabalia in northern Gaza on Tuesday, striking a hospital and destroying residential areas with a tank and air bombardments, residents said, while Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 5 people in Rafah. Simultaneous Israeli assaults on northern and southern edges of the Gaza Strip this month have caused new exodus of hundreds of thousands of people fleeing their homes and sharply restricted the flow of aid, raising risk of famine. And again, you know, this is absolutely known that this was going to cause a famine. The Biden administration told Israel specifically they could not do it for that reason. They had to have a plan for the civilians. Israel did anyways, and we're just going to keep sending them weapons. All right, next up here. Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, May 21st. UN halts food distribution in Rafah, aid not being delivered through U.S. pier. So here we go. The UN said Tuesday that it halted food distribution in the southern city of Rafah due to a lack of supplies and that no aid trucks were entering the strip through the U.S.-built pier. The vital Rafah border crossing has been closed to aid delivery since it was captured by Israeli forces on May 7th, an operation that was approved by President Biden. The UN estimates that over 800,000 Palestinians have fled Rafah since Israel launched its assault, but hundreds of thousands remain, as an estimated 1.4 million civilians were sheltering in the city before the Israeli operation. The UN World Food Program, that's the WPF, said it was also running out of food for central Gaza and is warning that humanitarian operations in Gaza are near collapse and food needs to enter the strip in massive quantities or famine-like conditions will spread. Only 21 aid trucks enter Gaza through the $320 million U.S. built pier. 10 trucks went through on Friday and made it to the WFP, but on Saturday, 11 aid trucks came through the pier were raided by hungry Palestinians. WFP said Israel needs to provide conditions for aid groups to operate safely, or the U.S. built pier will fail. WFP spokesperson said, "We have raised this issue with the relevant parties and reiterated our request for alternative roads to facilitate a delivery. Unless we receive the necessary clearance and coordination to use additional routes, this operation may not be successful." President Biden ordered the construction of the pier instead of pressuring Israel to open more border crossings, which is by far the most efficient way to get aid into Gaza. The U.S. claims it is opposed to Israel's restrictions on aid deliveries, but has not imposed any consequences for the closure of the Rafah crossing and tightening the starvation blockade. So, again, just no food getting into Gaza at this point is absolutely horrific for the people there. All right, Ben-Gvir says he would be very happy to live in Gaza. So this is the Israeli National Security Minister Ben-Gvir has repeated his call for the exodus of Palestinians from Gaza to make room for Jewish settlers, saying he would be very happy to live in the Strip. In an interview with the Hardei news outlet, Ben-Gvir said Israel must complete control of Gaza. Only the state of Israel, no one else. A full occupation of Gaza, Israeli control, Jewish settlement, but that's not enough. This is another very important essential step, which is encouraging immigration. So again, he wants to drive all the Palestinians out of Gaza. He calls it voluntary immigration to force all of them out at the barrel of an Israeli tank. When asked what if he meant the reestablishment of Jewish settlements that were dismantled in 2005, he said that Israel should go much further. Not only that, if we do indeed see immigration with hundreds of thousands leaving, we could bring in more and more people, he said, adding, "I would be very happy to live in Gaza." Ben-Gvir and other Israeli officials have framed their desire for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza as voluntary migration, but the Israeli onslaught is making the Strip uninhabitable and could give the Palestinians no choice but to leave or die. While Ben-Gvir and other members of his Jewish Power Party are considered extremists in Israeli politics, he has significant power as the Minister of National Security, where he oversees Israeli police, prisons, and border guards. The desire for a total takeover of the Gaza Strip is also shared by other politicians, including Netanyahu's Likud party. Communications Minister is a member of Likud, recently joined Ben-Gvir at a march calling for the settlement in Gaza and the expulsion of Palestinians. In order to preserve the security achievements that our soldiers lost their lives, we must resettle Gaza with the security forces and settlers that will embrace the land with love, the communications minister said. And more about that communications minister here. Israel seizes AP's equipment, reverses move after pressure. So Israeli authorities seized broadcasting equipment from the Associated Press and blocked the outlet's live feed of Gaza. The move is part of a crackdown on media in Israel. The White House expressed concern over the theft of the American outlet's equipment. The AP reports the Israeli government later ordered the cameras to be returned to the journalists and the feed was restored. So on Tuesday, Israel seized cameras and broadcasting equipment used by the AP in southern Israel. Tel Aviv claimed that the AP was in violation of a new law allowing the government to ban Al Jazeera. The communications minister argued that the new law extends to any organization providing material to the Qatari-based outlet, giving him the power to shut down AP's live stream. The AP said the order they were given was signed by the communications minister, who is a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. After the live stream was shut down, a senior AP official slammed Tel Aviv. So Lauren Easton, who is the vice president of corporate communications, said, "The Associated Press decries in the strongest terms the actions of the Israeli government to shut down our long-standing live feed showing a view into Gaza and the seizure of AP's equipment. The shutdown was not based on the content of the feed, but rather an abuse by the Israeli government of the country's new foreign broadcaster law. On Thursday, the communications minister ordered the AP to halt its live stream of Gaza. The AP argues that its video coverage of the Strip complies with the Israeli censorship laws and refused to comply with Tel Aviv's order. The seizure drew prompt backlash from the Israeli and American governments, leading to a reversal of the move later in the day. While the AP welcomed the reversal, a top official at the outlet expressed ongoing concern about freedom of the press in Israel. While we are pleased with this development, we remain concerned about the Israeli government's use of foreign broadcaster law and the ability of independent journalists to operate freely in Israel. The White House, which has largely refused to condemn anything Israel has done over the past 7 months, said it was concerned by the censorship. The Israeli opposition figure, Yair Lapid, called it an act of madness. This is not Al Jazeera. This is an American media outlet that has won 53 Pulitzer Prizes, Lapid posted on X. This government behaves as if it has decided to make sure at all costs Israel will be swayed all over the world. They went crazy. So couldn't agree with that more. And Lapid himself is not any kind of moderate or wants the AP to have this feed because he's concerned about what Tel Aviv is doing to the Palestinians. All right, next up here. House GOP bill would give benefits to Americans in the Israeli military. A bill introduced in the House of Representatives would extend certain benefits for Americans serving in the U.S. military to American citizens in the Israeli military. The legislation introduced on May 17th would give Americans in the Israeli Defense Forces protections under the Service Members Relief Act and the Uniformed Service Employment and Re-employment Rights Act. The laws that they're now going to get the benefit of protects U.S. service members from civil legal action while they're on active duty and up for a year after. The protection of civilian employment of active and reserve military personnel when they're called to active duty. So one of the representatives said over 20,000 American citizens are currently defending Israel from Hamas terrorists, risking their lives for the betterment of our ally. The Washington Post reported in February that an estimated 23,380 American citizens are serving in the Israeli military. Many are dual citizens who are already living in Israel, but as of November 2023, about 10,000 people living in the U.S. had traveled to Israel to report for duty with the IDF after receiving draft notices. According to Responsible Statecraft, 21 American citizens serving in the IDF have been killed in Gaza, and one was killed in northern Israel near the Lebanon border. The representative said his legislation will ensure that we do everything possible to support those heroes who are staying with Israel, fighting for freedom, and combating terrorism in the Middle East. It is unclear what the chances the bill has to pass Congress and become law, but there are strong support for the Israeli military among House Republicans. For example, Brian Mast, a Republican from Florida, is an IDF veteran who recently wore his IDF uniform on Capitol Hill, and he did not receive any backlash for his colleagues for showing up to work in the House wearing the uniform of a foreign military. Republicans have introduced a slew of pro-Israel legislation over the past few months to show staunch support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, including bills to impose harsh punishment on college protesters. One bill introduced by Representative Andy Ogles would have sent protesters to Gaza. And of course, it's just sick to say that we're going to provide legal coverage to people who are engaged in a genocide. All right, last up here, this one from Jason Ditz, antiwar.com. Smolters calls for Israel to take over southern Lebanon if Hezbollah does not withdraw from border. So this, seems to be absolutely insane. I'm not sure Israel even has the military capabilities to pull this off right now, given how much they've been struggling in Gaza, and that they're back in areas like Jabalia, central Gaza, that they've had previous claim to already clear of Hamas. But on Sunday, Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich called for the Israeli military to invade and take over southern Lebanon if Hezbollah does not withdraw from the border. He said that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs to issue an ultimatum to Hezbollah. A public ultimatum must be issued to Hezbollah that they completely stop firing and withdraw forces from behind the Litani River. He said at a meeting of his religious Zionism party, if the ultimatum is not fully met, the IDF will launch an assault deep in Lebanon territory to defend the northern communities, including ground entry and Israeli military takeover of the southern Lebanon area, he explained. He said the only way to return Israelis to northern areas that have been evacuated is through the military decision, with a devastating assault on Hezbollah, its infrastructure, and the destruction of its power. Again, that really doesn't seem possible to me, but it's very concerning that we have a high-ranking or fairly influential Israeli public official making those statements. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We're going to have a ton more for the rest of the week, so continue to tune in, subscribe. I really appreciate it.